We're doing something a little bit different this week. Instead of covering another goof-type suit, as I usually do for Gundam Battle Academy, this time we'll be covering a special request. In this case, the R-Jarja. The R-Jarja is a 500 to 650 point raid with Space Specialization, though it can be used on the ground too. I don't normally cover suits like the R-Jarja in Gundam Battle Academy. This is because for quite a while, it was 100% a meta pick. The shine has since faded, and it lives, like many raids, under the specter of heavy attack being around, but it's so focused on its design, and it's so effective at what it does, that it's impossible to not be respectful of this thing. While being heavily melee-focused, the R-Jarja has more than enough range punch, much like the Gyan Eos does in the general class, to be effective at almost any range with a little bit of practice, and depending on how you tool it out with custom parts, it can be insanely effective if you do. That customization is actually one of the R-Jarja's hallmarks. You can actually drag it in one of about 5 different directions depending on what level it is, and what custom parts you have available. Mikhail, for example, tended to run it as he runs most suits, which is to say, he spikes its damage output and goes directly for that, since dead enemies can't fight back and you don't have to worry about an empty gun no matter how big it is. To contrast, one of my other friends goes all in on durability, spiking its HP and defense. My own personal R-Jarja loadout tends to be somewhere in the middle. Honestly, I tend to run the suit a lot more shooty than other players probably would, but you can absolutely do that with the R-Jarja. I basically play it similar to how I play the Gundam Marine, but with way better zoning. By default, in terms of stats, it initially comes across as a raid version of the Galbaldi Alpha. Solid melee defense, satisfactory beam defense, Camphor tier ballistic resistance. It is very easy to custom part your way out of that particular hole, however. It's extremely fast with 135 base movement speed and 225 when boosting, a nice meaty 75 thrusters to start, and a very high turning rate. All this on a suit with over 17,000 base HP, and emergency evasion too. It also has maneuver armor. This thing has almost anything you could possibly want in a close combat raid. Very high damage output, an extremely aggressive profile, and buffer skills for both its legs and its shoulder binders, which ensures that a lot of the time you're going to be taking reduced damage from attacks. Yet, despite all of this, it's mostly fallen by the wayside, and the reason is heavy attack. However, in this particular case, the idiot's loss is your gain. If you are a fan of the Gyan, if you are a fan of the Galbaldi Alpha, if you are a fan of the Gelgoog Marine, you can find a way to make this suit work. And while this thing does not have heavy attack, that really doesn't matter when this thing's damage output from every range is pretty good. The R-Jarja has an especially robust offensive toolkit. Veteran Alex players will often tout that their beam rifle is one of the best weapons in GBO2. And they're not wrong. The primary fire mode for the Alex beam rifle doesn't do a lot of damage, but it doesn't heat up much, and it fires very quickly, allowing for easy accumulation stagger, despite relatively mid-range damage. However, when you factor in the low heat, and of course the high fire rate, it has one of the highest DPSs in the game. In terms of beam rifles, at least. For those times when you need raw punch and a stagger, it can charge up very quickly to fire a charged beam that's not quite as strong as the Gelgoog beam rifle, but doesn't have to be. The R-Jarja's bayonet beam rifle, which I will add is also the primary weapon for the Zaku 3, is essentially an ammo-based, stronger version of the Alex's beam rifle with a negligibly slower fire rate. Charging it, meanwhile, increases the range by 100, almost doubles the firepower, and makes it instant stagger, while not consuming any additional ammo. And this is on a suit with a 10-round mag, and all it takes is 2 hits to a vulnerable spot to induce an accumulation stagger with this thing. The combat style will seem very familiar to anyone who played around with the GM's beam spray gun, and I'm sure the lone GM player of someplace is very happy to hear this. But because of this, your approach game can actually be pretty simple. You can either play it like a Gelgoog and use the charge shot, or you can give him some uncharged shots in order to slow the enemy down and induce an accumulation stagger. Either way, you get the enemy stunned, you switch to one of your 2 melee weapons, and proceed to go to town. But wait, there's more! You don't have to get stuck in. You can stay at mid-range and just keep picking them off. The fact that you are a melee suit that doesn't immediately have to go there is a huge upside, even though that is unquestionably where your suit is strongest. Even better, if you front-loaded a bit of range damage onto the R-Jarja, it's actually an extremely damaging option. Making all of this even better is the second weapon on the R-Jarja, which is its shoulder rockets. 400 range, 12 shots, fires like a machine gun, and fires up into the air before directly at the target. These little missiles are an outrageously good zoning tool. Their splash means you can easily do some damage on the way in, but even better, you can shoot these things while boosting. Mikhail was particularly fond of this tactic, but basically, you can charge right at the enemy, fire off a salvo of these goddamn things, switch to a melee weapon mid-go, and immediately start opening face once you get there. They reload extremely quickly in under 8 seconds. Even better, they're pretty powerful. A full pod hitting is 4,200 damage, and that's without any damage boosting. When used alongside its beam rifle, the R-Jarja is capable of hosing out an armor-shredding volume of firepower at medium range. Way more damaging, in fact, than you'd ever reasonably expect a melee-focused raid to do. But it's the melee damage that defines the R-Jarja. The Gyan ancestry is very strong with this one. A 2,600 base damage beam saber, with what is basically the Galbaldi Alpha's melee moveset, backed by a beam rifle bayonet that isn't all that damaging in terms of base damage, but has extremely high modifiers. As is the case for the R-Jarja's primary weapon loadout, this secondary loadout is all about DPS and comboing from one melee weapon to the other. With a bit of practice, you can absolutely devour enemy HP with this thing, type advantages notwithstanding, to say nothing of what you will do to enemies that are actually weak to you. If you're not especially good with the dual melee shuffle, and I know I'm not particularly good with it, you can still reliably get mileage out of it by focusing on the primary melee and then using the bayonet for the downswing to follow it up. The best R-Jarja users, however, will be able to easily shuffle between weapons and use them to maximum effect. Even better, because of how good your range weapons are and the fact that you can fire one of them boost, you can also easily disengage if the situation calls for it, backdashing and showering the target with rockets. You have maneuver armor during that too, so it's a remarkably safe option if you have the room for it. All of this means that the R-Jarja is kind of unusual in that there's really not a bad range for it outside extremely long. The biggest problem you face as the R-Jarja is that in the bracket you come out in, heavy attackers are a thing, but the real threat are the new generals that just come out. The Jagan and Gyaradoga both hang out here, and both are really, really good at dealing with aggressive melee fighters. You can't just get mindlessly aggressive with the R-Jarja. You have to use it like a swordsman might. You have to know when to advance, know when to back off, know when to use your ranged weapons, and know when to swap to your melee weapons. In my opinion, the most critical skill you're going to have to learn if you're going to be using the R-Jarja a lot is getting experienced with how its ranged weapons aim and handle. It is a very rare raid that can comfortably say, oh yeah, I'm one of the best melee attackers in the bracket, but I also have 2 amazing ranged weapons. So where exactly does the R-Jarja rate on the Jameis tier list? Well, let's break it out and we'll go over it. At 500, excellent tier. This was, until relatively recently, one of, if not the best melee raids in the bracket. The only meaningful competition it has is the Nightseeker V, which is basically a stealth Marasai that has 3 melee weapons. But the Nightseeker V doesn't have anywhere near the mid-range DPS of the R-Jarja, nor does it have EES-2. The Jar Jar also happens to have better melee priority, so if it comes to a slugfest between these two, the Jar Jar's usually going to win, assuming an equally skilled pilot. Moreover, heavy attack has not completely removed the relevance of this suit. All those terrible Regency players who think that they're the best raids around, yeah, they're not, and the R-Jarja is easily capable of proving that. However, getting the most out of it actually requires experience, skill, and practice. 550, good tier. The only thing keeping it out of excellent is the glut of high-performance raids that show up at this tier. The Gapland, Buu, Hyakushiki, Z-Zulu, GPO2BB, Gabera Tetra. There's a ton of awesome raids that show up at exactly this point. The R-Jarja can easily keep pace with them, especially if it's equipped properly, but it's going to require effort in order to keep up, despite the fact that it's not really all that much weaker. 600, good tier. Surprisingly, the Jarja has a lot going for it out of this bracket, despite the fact that it's increasingly in the outgunned category. The added slots it's getting are a big help, the fact that it still has EES-2 is fantastic, and its increased scaling has made it a lot tougher. There's a lot of new opposition coming out, like the Hambrabi, and more shooty raids, like the Zeta Plus A1, yet despite this, it's still managing to hold its own. 650. At this point, the R-Jarja gains something it never had before, namely level 2 enhancements and access to overtune parts. Either of those on their own would be enough to keep the R-Jarja in its bracket. Together, they pretty much seal it. 23 close-range slots, 20 medium-range slots, and 12 long-range slots. That is what you are playing with at this point. It has to deal with the hardest opposition to date, but yeah, you're not going to have any trouble doing that if you've already gotten experience with the R-Jarja and you got the parts to back it up. The problem is that you need the parts to back it up. At this point, you're running into funnel suits, the like of the Rebel Wu, the Totus Ritter, the O. Any of these suits individually are a problem. Now try running into them as a group. It's because of that that you need the enhancements and you need the parts to get the most out of the R-Jarja at this tier. If you do have them, it's absolutely good tier. If you don't, yeah, it gets bumped down to poor. 700, it's poor tier. Not really much to say there. All in all, as you can see, the R-Jarja is a phenomenal raid, which is all the more reason it's not usually the type of suit I cover on my channel. As I've said a few times, it takes practice and experience, but if you're willing to put in the time, it will treat you very well. So if you do have one and you're willing to give it a shot, go out there and make Grampy Gyan proud.